August 15, 1945. The Emperor's voice crackled over radio waves across the Pacific, announcing Japan's surrender. For millions of Japanese soldiers scattered across the Pacific Islands, the war was over. But for thousands who had been captured in the final months of fighting, a different kind of shock was about to begin. Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Navy had been captured 3 weeks earlier during the Battle of Okinawa. Wounded and delirious from fever, he barely remembered the American medics who had saved his life, or the transport ship that carried him away from the smoking ruins of his homeland's final defense. What he did remember was the cold. Not the bitter cold of a Manchurian winter that Japanese soldiers knew well, but an artificial cold that seemed to emanate from strange white boxes aboard the American hospital ship USS Repose. The corpsmen called them refrigerators, and they hummed constantly with electric power, a sound that never ceased even during the humid Pacific nights. The Japanese prisoners watched in bewilderment as American sailors casually opened these white boxes and removed bottles of milk so cold that condensation formed instantly on the glass. Milk that hadn't spoiled in the tropical heat. Milk that was somehow colder than the ocean itself. The bottles sweated moisture in the warm air, creating puddles on the metal deck that evaporated and reformed in an endless cycle. They must waste enormous amounts of energy to keep food cold, whispered Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka to his fellow prisoners as they observed the daily routine of American logistics. In Japan, ice was a luxury reserved for the wealthy even in peacetime. During the war, ice had become as rare as meat or sugar, something spoken of in whispers among civilians who remembered better times. The transport ship carried 847 Japanese prisoners toward an unknown destination. Most had never seen electric refrigeration before. In their homeland, food preservation meant salting, drying, or fermentation techniques passed down through generations. Fish was dried in the sun, vegetables pickled in salt, rice stored in wooden containers that breathed with the seasons. The casual abundance of refrigerated storage suggested resources beyond their comprehension. Private First Class Kenji Nakamura, a farmer's son from Kyushu, kept a diary during the voyage using paper scraps and pencil stubs provided by sympathetic corpsmen. His entries, discovered decades later by his grandson while cleaning out a storage room, captured the psychological impact of witnessing American logistics in their most mundane form. Day 3 aboard the American ship. The Americans throw away more food in one day than my family saw in a month before I was conscripted. They have machines that keep fish fresh for weeks. I watched a sailor pour milk down a drain because it had been open for 2 days. 2 days. In Japan, milk that fresh would be a gift from the gods. They waste ice like we waste water, but perhaps they have so much that waste means nothing to them. The prisoners huddled together in converted cargo holds, watching through portholes as the endless Pacific rolled past. They had been told by their officers that Americans were soft, weak from luxury, unable to endure hardship. Yet these same soft Americans had systematically destroyed the Imperial Japanese Navy across 6,000 miles of ocean, using industrial might that seemed to operate by different rules than anything the prisoners understood. During mealtimes, the cultural shock deepened. American military rations exceeded what Japanese soldiers had received even at the height of their empire's power. White bread, fresh vegetables when available, meat portions that would have fed a Japanese family for days. But most shocking was the waste. Half-eaten meals thrown into garbage bins, bread crusts discarded, fruit peels composted without thought. They eat like emperors and throw away food like peasants, observed Captain Ichiro Sato, a veteran of the China campaigns who had seen famine firsthand. Either they are the richest people on earth, or they understand nothing about scarcity. His voice carried the bewilderment of a man whose worldview was cracking along invisible fault lines. The ship's medical bay provided another window into American abundance. Wounded Japanese prisoners received the same treatment as American casualties, a violation of everything they had been taught about racial hierarchy and military honor. Dr. Robert Chun, a Chinese-American Navy surgeon, spoke fluent Japanese and explained procedures with patience that confused men who had been trained to expect brutal treatment from captors. In Japan, Lieutenant Yamamoto confided to Dr. Chun during a medical examination, "We were told Americans would torture us, work us to death in mines, use us for medical experiments." Yet you heal our wounds and feed us like guests. The contradiction gnawed at him during long nights in the ship's hull, listening to the constant hum of refrigeration units that never slept. The refrigeration machines became objects of fascination for the prisoners. Technical minds among them, engineers and mechanics who had maintained aircraft and ships, studied the cooling systems with professional interest. The compressors ran continuously, powered by generators that consumed fuel at rates that would have bankrupted Japanese military logistics. The cooling capacity alone represented energy expenditure that exceeded the electrical production of entire Japanese towns. Sergeant Takashi Ito, an aircraft mechanic from Nagoya, calculated that the ship's refrigeration systems used more electricity in one day than his hometown factory had available in a month. They cool food with power that could run a small city, he wrote in letters that would never be sent. This is not efficiency. This is abundance so complete that efficiency becomes irrelevant. As the ship approached the American mainland, the prisoners pressed against portholes to catch glimpses of their destination. The California coastline blazed with electric lights even in daylight, a constellation of power that made the darkened cities of wartime Japan seem medieval by comparison. Neon signs advertised products they had never heard of, buildings rose higher than Japanese pagodas, and automobiles filled roads like schools of fish in the ocean. But nothing prepared them for the ice cream vendors along the San Francisco waterfront. Through binoculars provided by guards, they watched civilians buying frozen treats as casually as one might buy rice in a Tokyo market. Children licked colorful confections while their parents counted coins without apparent concern for cost. The casual nature of the transaction suggested that frozen dairy products were so common as to be unremarkable. They give children ice in the middle of summer, Yamamoto wrote in his diary. Ice mixed with sugar and milk, shaped into elaborate forms. The children eat this frozen luxury like it costs nothing, while their parents smile and buy more. What kind of society feeds ice to children as a daily treat? The prisoners assumed they were being transported to work camps in America, similar to the brutal labor conditions they had imposed on Allied prisoners throughout the Pacific. They expected starvation rations, beatings, and death from exhaustion. What they couldn't anticipate was that their captivity would become an education in American abundance, beginning with something as simple and impossible as ice cream. As the USS Repose entered San Francisco Bay, the Japanese prisoners caught their first glimpse of American civilian life in peacetime prosperity. The Golden Gate Bridge rose above them like a testament to engineering ambition, its cables gleaming in the afternoon sun. Below, the city sprawled in organized abundance, every street lit with electric power, every building testimony to resources that seemed unlimited. They had come to America expecting punishment and found plenty. The abundance would prove more psychologically devastating than any torture, more transformative than any re-education program, and more effective than any propaganda. The ice cream was waiting. September 3, 1945. Angel Island Immigration Station, San Francisco Bay. The converted facility now served as a processing center for Japanese prisoners of war, its buildings overlooking water that sparkled with reflected city lights. As the men were marched off the transport ships, they encountered their first direct contact with American civilian life in all its bewildering prosperity. San Francisco blazed across the bay, its lights visible even in the afternoon sunlight. Every building seemed to have electric power, every street corner illuminated with a casual disregard for energy conservation that staggered men who had lived through years of blackouts and rationing. Neon signs advertised Coca-Cola, Lucky Strike cigarettes, and products the prisoners had never heard of. Electric streetcars ran on time, automobiles filled parking lots, and pedestrians moved with the unhurried confidence of people who had never known true scarcity. Most shocking of all were the ice cream vendors positioned strategically along the waterfront, serving civilians who bought frozen treats with the casual indifference of routine consumption. Lieutenant Yamamoto watched in fascination as American children licked colorful frozen confections while their parents counted out coins without visible concern for cost. The transaction took seconds, the consumption minutes, the waste nothing at all as empty sticks and wrappers went into trash bins that were emptied regularly by city workers. They give children ice in the middle of the day, he recorded in observations that would be censored but preserved in camp files. ice mixed with sugar and milk, shaped into elaborate forms that cost more labor to create than simple nutrition would justify. The children eat this frozen luxury like it costs nothing, while their parents buy newspapers and cigarettes and conduct the business of abundance. During the initial processing, military efficiency met American abundance in ways that challenged every assumption the prisoners held about resource allocation. The Geneva Convention required adequate nutrition for prisoners of war, but nothing in their experience had prepared them for the reality of American prison rations. The meals served during their first day of captivity exceeded in quality and quantity what Japanese soldiers had received even at the height of their empire's power. White bread, baked fresh daily in camp kitchens equipped with electric ovens that ran continuously. Fresh vegetables, when available, transported by refrigerated trucks that maintained cold temperatures across hundreds of miles. Meat portions that would have fed a Japanese family for days, served as individual rations without thought for conservation. Milk that came from glass bottles stored in walk-in refrigerators that hummed with constant electric power. But the revelation came with dessert. The transformation from prisoners expecting brutality to men experiencing luxury began when American guards wheeled large metal containers packed with ice into the mess hall. The containers steamed in the warm afternoon air, creating clouds of condensation that suggested temperatures far below ambient. From these Arctic vessels, mess sergeants scooped out perfect spheres of frozen cream, placing them in small bowls for each prisoner with the mechanical precision of industrial abundance. Sergeant Tanaka stared at his portion in genuine bewilderment. The substance was white like snow but somehow creamy and smooth, its surface already beginning to melt in the California heat. Steam rose from the frozen sphere as it encountered warm air, creating visual effects that seemed almost magical to men who had never seen artificially created ice in such quantities. The bowl itself was metal, manufactured to precise specifications, and chilled from contact with its contents. "What is this?" he asked the American guard in broken English learned from captured phrase books and overheard conversations during his months in the Pacific Theater. "Ice cream, vanilla flavor," came the reply in accented but understandable Japanese from Sergeant First Class James Tanaka, a Nisei soldier whose family had been interned while he served in Europe. "Standard dessert ration. You get it twice a week here, more on holidays." The cultural irony wasn't lost on either man. A Japanese-American soldier, whose own family had suffered because of their ancestry, serving ice cream to Japanese prisoners who had fought to destroy America. The complexity of the situation illustrated American society's contradictions in ways that pure propaganda never could have achieved. Sergeant Hiroshi Tanaka took a tentative taste with his regulation spoon. The cold hit his tongue first, a temperature shock that made his teeth ache. Then came sweetness beyond anything he had experienced, sugar content that exceeded Japan's entire wartime allocation for a family of 4. The texture was unlike ice, which was hard and crystalline. This was soft, creamy, dissolving on his tongue into flavors that seemed chemically impossible. The vanilla flavoring itself represented industrial sophistication that Japanese food processing couldn't match. Real vanilla beans, processed through chemical extraction methods, combined with dairy products that required refrigerated supply chains from farm to factory to consumer. The entire production process demanded infrastructure that Japan had never possessed, even at the height of its imperial expansion. Around him, 847 Japanese prisoners were having the same revelation simultaneously. Men who had endured years of military discipline and wartime deprivation were experiencing a luxury that surpassed anything in their previous lives. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating to their worldview. They had been told Americans were soft, weak, unable to endure hardship. Yet these soft Americans had created industrial systems capable of producing frozen desserts for prisoners of war. Private Nakamura recorded the moment in diary entries that captured the cognitive dissonance. "I thought it was some kind of test or torture. Cold punishment for the summer heat, designed to break our spirits through temperature shock. Then the sweetness came, and I understood that this was not punishment but abundance. It was like eating a cloud made of milk and sugar, flavored with essences I couldn't identify. I understood then that Americans live like emperors, every one of them, even their prisoners." The ice cream distribution wasn't accompanied by speeches about democracy or freedom. There were no lectures about American superiority or Japanese defeat. The guards simply served dessert and moved on to other duties, treating the frozen luxury as routine as distributing soap or blankets. This casual approach to abundance proved more psychologically effective than any propaganda program could have been. As the prisoners consumed their ice cream, they began to understand the mathematics of American victory in new terms. This wasn't just military success, but systemic abundance that operated according to principles they had never encountered. The ability to manufacture, store, transport, and serve frozen desserts to enemy prisoners suggested resource allocation capabilities that transcended normal economic constraints. The mess hall itself reinforced this impression. Electric lights that burned continuously without concern for energy conservation. Steam tables that kept food hot for hours using power that could have illuminated Japanese villages. Dishwashing machines that cleaned hundreds of plates using heated water and mechanical action, operated by soldiers who treated such labor-saving devices as standard equipment. Captain Ishida, observing the entire operation with professional military interest, began to comprehend the industrial foundation of American military success. The same society that could serve ice cream to prisoners had built the world's largest navy, produced aircraft in quantities that overwhelmed Japanese manufacturing capacity, and sustained military operations across two oceans simultaneously. "We measured strength by endurance of hardship," he wrote in reports later found among camp documents. "They measure strength by elimination of hardship. We thought victory came through suffering. They prove victory comes through abundance. Every spoonful of ice cream demonstrates industrial capacity we never imagined." The psychological transformation was immediate and irreversible. Men who had arrived expecting brutality discovered generosity. Soldiers who had been taught that Americans were racially inferior encountered systematic efficiency that exceeded Japanese military standards. Warriors who believed in Bushido faced opponents who combined overwhelming force with unexpected humanity. The ice cream became a symbol of everything they had misunderstood about their enemy. Sweet where they expected bitter, cold where they expected hot, abundant where they expected scarce, generous where they expected cruel. As the frozen cream dissolved on their tongues, so did their certainty about the war, their cause, and their understanding of strength itself. In the weeks that followed, as more prisoners arrived from across the Pacific, the ice cream ritual continued. Each group experienced the same shock, the same cognitive dissonance, the same gradual recognition that they had fundamentally misjudged their opponents. The dessert became an unofficial introduction to American abundance, more effective than any re-education program because it required no words, no arguments, no propaganda. The prisoners simply ate, and in eating, learned. The ice cream distribution at Angel Island wasn't a special treat or a propaganda gesture designed to impress newly arrived prisoners. It was simply Tuesday. As the Japanese POWs were transferred to permanent camps across the American mainland, they discovered that ice cream was as routine as rice had been in Japan, served twice weekly along with other desserts that challenged their understanding of resource allocation and social priorities. At Camp Livingston, Louisiana, over 4,000 Japanese POWs discovered that ice cream was manufactured on-site using equipment that represented more industrial capacity than many Japanese cities possessed. The camp's dairy facility included pasteurization equipment, homogenization systems, flavoring apparatus, and freezing units that operated around the clock, consuming electricity at rates that would have powered entire Japanese neighborhoods. Technical Sergeant Yoshio Matsuda, an engineer who had designed fortifications across the Pacific Theater, studied the ice cream machinery with the focused attention of a professional trying to understand impossible technology. The electric motors alone consumed more power than entire Japanese villages had access to during peacetime. The refrigeration systems required copper tubing that Japan had been stripping from temples and household appliances to manufacture ammunition and aircraft components. "They use more metal in one ice cream machine than we used to build a fighter plane," Matsuda observed to his fellow prisoners during evening discussions that were monitored but not interrupted by camp authorities. The copper coils in their refrigeration systems contain more raw material than our aircraft factories received in monthly allocations. Either they have infinite resources, or they have completely different priorities than any civilized nation we understand. The psychological impact went beyond mere luxury or technological superiority. Ice cream represented a fundamental difference in worldview that challenged core assumptions about the relationship between strength and sacrifice. Japanese military culture emphasized deprivation as character building, teaching soldiers to find strength through suffering, to view comfort as weakness that corrupted fighting spirit, to embrace hardship as purification of the warrior's soul. Yet here were their captors, demonstrating military supremacy while simultaneously indulging in frozen desserts that required elaborate production processes and constant energy expenditure. The contradiction challenged every assumption about discipline, strength, and the sources of military effectiveness that had shaped Japanese military thinking for generations. Captain Ryosuke Ishida, a career officer from a samurai family that had served the emperor for 12 generations, struggled to reconcile American military effectiveness with apparent decadence. In letters to his family that were censored but preserved in camp files, he attempted to explain the paradox. These Americans defeated our finest warriors while eating ice cream twice per week. They built the most powerful military in history, while their soldiers enjoy luxuries that our emperors never knew. They waste energy on frozen desserts while producing aircraft that dominate our skies and ships that control our seas. I am beginning to think we misunderstood the nature of strength itself. The flavors multiplied the psychological shock. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, mint, banana, coffee, and combinations that seemed designed to demonstrate abundance rather than serve nutritional purposes. Some camps offered elaborate preparations. Hot fudge sundaes that combined frozen cream with heated chocolate sauce. Banana splits that used more fruit than Japanese families saw in months. Ice cream sodas that mixed frozen dessert with carbonated beverages that themselves represented industrial processing capabilities. Each new variation demonstrated not just abundance, but creativity applied to pleasure rather than necessity. The Americans had devoted engineering talent and industrial resources to perfecting recreational food consumption, treating enjoyment as a legitimate use of national productive capacity. This approach to resource allocation violated everything the Japanese had been taught about efficiency, discipline, and proper social priorities. Lieutenant Colonel Masahiko Takahashi, the highest-ranking officer at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, documented the cultural impact in detailed reports he compiled for potential future military intelligence use. His analysis revealed the depth of the psychological transformation occurring among the prisoners. The Americans have weaponized comfort. They demonstrate superiority not through superior deprivation of enemies, but through casual display of abundance that makes our wartime sacrifices appear meaningless. Every spoonful of ice cream reminds us that they possess resources we never imagined, industrial capacity we never approached, and social confidence we never achieved. They feed prisoners better than we fed our own officers, and they do this without apparent strain on their economic system. The seasonal independence of ice cream production provided another layer of cultural shock. Winter 1945 brought the unexpected revelation that ice cream consumption didn't decrease with cold weather, but actually increased during months when natural ice formation would have made artificial cooling seem redundant. American guards explained that ice cream was popular year-round, that Americans ate frozen desserts even in snow, that seasonal temperature variations didn't influence consumption patterns. This independence from natural conditions represented technological mastery that transcended Japanese understanding of the proper relationship between human activity and environmental constraints. In Japan, seasonal eating was fundamental to culture, cuisine, and survival strategy. Spring vegetables, summer fruits, autumn grains, winter preservation. The entire cycle of life followed natural rhythms that no technology could alter. Americans had apparently conquered seasons themselves, creating artificial winter inside their ice cream factories while maintaining artificial summer in their heated buildings. The energy expenditure required for such climate control exceeded the total power generation capacity of most Japanese cities, yet Americans treated this environmental manipulation as routine rather than remarkable. The prisoners learned to make ice cream as part of camp work assignments and re-education programs. Camp administrators, following Geneva Convention guidelines and post-war planning directives, provided vocational training that would prepare prisoners for eventual repatriation to a Japan that would need rebuilding from the ground up. Ice cream production became part of food service education, teaching skills that might prove valuable in post-war reconstruction. Japanese POWs learned to operate pasteurization equipment, to manage refrigeration systems, to create flavors and textures that would have seemed magical months earlier. They studied supply chain management, quality control procedures, and industrial hygiene practices that exceeded standards in Japanese civilian food production. The technical knowledge transferred during ice cream production represented industrial education that Japan's universities couldn't provide. Corporal Jiro Watanabe, assigned to kitchen duty at Camp Jerome, Arkansas, compiled detailed instructions for ice cream production that he hoped to preserve for post-war use. His notebook, written in precise technical Japanese supplemented with American measurements and procedures, contained recipes and techniques alongside philosophical observations about American industrial culture. Americans have turned milk into dreams. They have made winter from electricity. They create joy from simple ingredients through machines that never rest, powered by energy that flows like water from sources we cannot see. If we can learn to make ice cream, perhaps we can learn to rebuild Japan using principles we never understood. The notebooks became unofficial textbooks, copied and shared among prisoners who recognized that they were receiving education in industrial processes that could transform post-war Japan. The technical knowledge embedded in ice cream production, refrigeration, pasteurization, quality control, supply chain management, energy utilization, represented skills that would be essential for rebuilding a modern economy. The psychological transformation was measurable in camp behavior statistics. Escape attempts dropped to nearly zero, not from despair, but from growing recognition that America offered opportunities that Japan could not match. Educational program participation increased dramatically as prisoners sought to understand the industrial systems that had created such abundance. Work assignment productivity exceeded military requirements as prisoners applied themselves to learning American methods. The ice cream had become more than dessert. It was education in abundance, demonstration of possibility, and proof that prosperity was achievable through industrial efficiency rather than military conquest. The frozen cream that had initially shocked the prisoners was now teaching them to reimagine their homeland's future. Winter 1945 brought revelations that deepened the cultural transformation already underway in American POW camps. As temperatures dropped across the continental United States, Japanese prisoners discovered that ice cream production and consumption didn't follow seasonal patterns they considered natural and logical. If anything, the artificial creation of frozen desserts intensified during months when outdoor temperatures would have provided free refrigeration. The apparent contradiction between environmental conditions and food production represented a level of technological mastery that transcended Japanese understanding of efficient resource utilization. Americans consumed ice cream in heated buildings while snow fell outside, creating simultaneous artificial winter and artificial summer through energy expenditure that exceeded the power generation capacity of entire Japanese prefectures. This seasonal independence from natural cooling demonstrated industrial control over environmental conditions that Japanese engineers had never imagined possible. The energy required to heat buildings, while simultaneously cooling dairy products into frozen desserts, violated every principle of conservation and efficiency that had shaped Japanese industrial thinking throughout the war. Major General Akira Yamashita, the senior Japanese officer at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, observed the winter ice cream operations with growing comprehension of American industrial philosophy. In detailed reports written for potential future intelligence use, he documented observations that revealed the scope of his psychological transformation. Americans treat energy like an unlimited resource because, for them, it essentially is unlimited. They generate electricity from coal, oil, hydroelectric systems, and atomic research that operates by principles we barely understand. They use this power to overcome natural limitations, to create summer conditions in winter buildings while producing winter foods in heated factories. This is not inefficiency, but abundance so complete that efficiency calculations become irrelevant. The repatriation process began in early 1946, as American authorities prepared to return Japanese prisoners to a homeland transformed beyond recognition by defeat, occupation, and the atomic bombings that had ended the war. The Japan they would find was a landscape of destroyed cities, collapsed economy, and a society struggling to comprehend the magnitude of its defeat and the necessity of complete reconstruction. But the prisoners carried with them knowledge of American abundance that would prove invaluable during the rebuilding process. They had witnessed industrial systems in operation, learned production techniques, and observed organizational methods that could be adapted to Japanese conditions. Their enforced education in American prosperity would influence Japan's reconstruction in ways that formal diplomatic agreements could never achieve. Lieutenant Yamamoto returned to Hiroshima in March 1946, traveling by hospital ship due to injuries that had healed under American medical care superior to anything available in wartime Japan. The city he found was a moonscape of atomic destruction, but American occupation forces were already distributing food aid that included ice cream for children in refugee camps established among the ruins. The irony wasn't lost on him as he watched Japanese children taste ice cream for the first time, their faces showing the same wonder and disbelief he had experienced as a prisoner 9 months earlier. The same nation that had incinerated his city was now feeding its children luxuries he had discovered only in captivity, demonstrating a capacity for both destruction and reconstruction that exceeded anything in Japanese historical experience. I watched Japanese children discover ice cream in the shadow of atomic destruction, he wrote in his post-war memoir, published in 1955 when Japan's economic recovery was accelerating. Their faces showed the same amazement I had felt as a prisoner of war. America had given us a gift more powerful than any weapon, the knowledge that abundance was possible, that prosperity could be created through industrial efficiency rather than military conquest. The transfer of ice cream technology to Japan began almost immediately. American occupation authorities, as part of broader democratization and modernization programs, encouraged the establishment of modern food processing industries that could improve Japanese nutrition and create employment opportunities. Ice cream production represented an accessible entry point into advanced industrial techniques that required relatively modest capital investment. By 1950, Japan's first modern ice cream factory opened in Tokyo, built with American equipment and technical expertise provided through economic recovery programs. Several former POWs worked as consultants and translators, applying knowledge gained in prison camp kitchens to civilian production systems. Their familiarity with American methods and equipment made them invaluable intermediaries between American suppliers and Japanese manufacturers. The Meiji Ice Cream Company, established in 1951 with American technical assistance, employed Sergeant Tanaka as a production manager based on his experience operating American ice cream machinery at Camp Livingston. His wartime captivity had qualified him for a management position in Japan's emerging modern food industry, transforming his prison camp education into civilian career advancement. Ice cream taught us that America's strength came not from superior endurance of suffering, but from the ability to create pleasure even during wartime. Tanaka explained to a Mainichi Shimbun reporter in 1955, as Japan's economic growth was beginning to accelerate. We learned that abundance and discipline could coexist, that prosperity and military power were partners rather than enemies, that industrial efficiency created wealth that could be shared rather than hoarded. The transformation was measurable in economic statistics that documented Japan's rapid adoption of American-style consumer goods production. Ice cream consumption grew from zero in 1945 to 50 million gallons annually by 1960, creating employment for thousands of workers and generating tax revenue that supported broader reconstruction programs. Former POWs established many of the early distribution networks, bringing American-style frozen desserts to Japanese consumers who were discovering prosperity for the first time. The psychological impact extended beyond immediate economic benefits. The success of ice cream production demonstrated that Japanese workers could master American industrial techniques, that Japanese companies could compete in consumer markets, and that Japanese society could embrace prosperity without abandoning cultural identity. The frozen desserts became symbols of successful modernization rather than foreign domination. The cultural significance deepened as children of former POWs grew up hearing stories about American abundance, prison camps where enemies were fed luxuries, and a nation so wealthy it could afford generosity toward defeated foes. These narratives became part of Japan's post-war mythology, contributing to the psychological transformation that would make Japan America's closest Pacific ally within a generation of total war. The stories shaped attitudes toward America, toward democracy, toward capitalism, and toward the possibility of peaceful prosperity that contrasted sharply with the military expansionism that had led to disaster. Parents who had experienced American abundance as prisoners taught their children that cooperation produced better results than conquest, that trade created more wealth than war, that former enemies could become partners in mutual prosperity. In 1975, on the 30th anniversary of Japan's surrender, a group of former Japanese POWs organized a reunion trip to visit the camps where they had been held. At Camp Shelby, now a training facility for the Mississippi National Guard, they were served ice cream in the same mess hall where they had first encountered frozen dessert 30 years earlier. The ceremony was covered by NHK television and major Japanese newspapers, documenting the transformation of former enemies into allies, prisoners into partners, and bitter defeat into prosperous friendship. The ice cream service that had once shocked Japanese prisoners now served as communion between former adversaries who had found common ground in shared values and mutual respect. Yoshio Matsuda, now a successful engineer who had helped design Japan's modern refrigeration industry, spoke at the commemoration dinner about the enduring impact of his prison camp education. "We came to America as enemies and discovered friends. We expected punishment and found generosity. We thought ice cream was impossible luxury and learned it was simply normal American life. That knowledge changed everything, not just our understanding of America, but our vision of what Japan could become." The final irony completed the circle of transformation. By 1980, Japan was exporting ice cream technology and frozen food equipment back to America, improving upon techniques that former POWs had learned in captivity. Japanese companies had become global leaders in refrigeration technology, food processing machinery, and quality control systems that set new international standards. The student had become the teacher, but the fundamental lesson remained unchanged. American abundance, demonstrated through something as simple as ice cream served to prisoners of war, had transformed enemies into allies, prisoners into partners, and military defeat into economic partnership. The cold sweetness that had shocked Japanese prisoners in 1945 had become a bridge between cultures, proof that prosperity shared was prosperity multiplied. The story of Japanese POWs and ice cream reveals a profound truth about the power of abundance to transform relationships and reshape societies. Sometimes the most effective diplomacy comes not from treaties or speeches, but from simple acts of generosity that demonstrate values more clearly than any declaration of principles. In sharing their ice cream with prisoners of war, Americans shared something more valuable than dessert. They shared a vision of what life could be like in a world where abundance was possible, where former enemies could become friends, where industrial capacity could create prosperity rather than destruction, and where the taste of frozen cream could melt the barriers between nations that had seemed permanent. That first spoonful of vanilla ice cream in September 1945 was more than a treat. It was a taste of the future, sweet, cold, and filled with possibilities that neither side had imagined when the war began 4 years earlier in Pearl Harbor's burning waters.